Gilles de Rais was a French nobleman, soldier, and one of the earliest known serial killers. He was born into a wealthy and powerful family in the region of Brittany. After his father's death in 1415, Gilles inherited his vast estates and became one of the richest men in France. Gilles first gained fame as a military commander during the 100 Years' War. He fought alongside Joan of Arc and helped capture important towns from the English. In 1429, he was appointed Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors. After the war, he spent his fortune on extravagant living, theatrical productions, and alchemical experiments. He became obsessed with regaining his lost wealth through occult practices, believing he could summon demons to help him. His desperation led him down a path of extreme violence. Between 1432 and 1440, Gilles kidnapped, raped, and murdered an unknown number of children, mostly boys between the ages of 6 and 18. He lured them into his castles, promising food, jobs, or education, but once captured, they were subjected to horrific abuse before being killed. The exact number of his victims is still debated by historians, but estimates range from 40 to over 140. The crimes remained hidden for years due to Gilles' high status and the isolated locations of his castles. However, his reckless spending and conflicts with the church and local authorities eventually led to an investigation. In 1440, Bishop Jean de Malestroit launched a formal inquiry into Gilles' activities. Witnesses, including servants and accomplices, gave detailed and horrifying testimonies. Gilles was arrested, tried, and found guilty of murder, sodomy, and heresy. During his trial, he confessed to the crimes and was sentenced to death. On October 26, 1440, he was hanged and burned in Nantes, France, in front of a large crowd. Some scholars suggest that he may have influenced the story of Bluebeard, a French folktale about a wealthy man who murders his wives. Others argue that political motives may have played a role in his downfall, though the overwhelming evidence from the trial points to his guilt. Jack the Ripper is the name given to an unidentified serial killer active in London in 1888. He is believed to have killed at least 5 women between August and November of that year. These women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, are referred to as the canonical 5 victims. Their deaths were especially brutal, with victims' throats being cut and sometimes their bodies mutilated after death. In the case of Mary Jane Kelly, the mutilation was so severe that she was almost unrecognizable. The nature of the killings suggested that the murderer had some knowledge of human anatomy, possibly pointing to him being a butcher, a surgeon, or a medical student. The murders caused widespread panic in London. Letters were sent to the police and media, supposedly from the killer. The most famous letter, the Dear Boss letter, was signed Jack the Ripper, a name that stuck. Another letter, called the From Hell letter, came with a piece of a human kidney, allegedly from a victim. Despite massive police efforts, Jack the Ripper was never caught. Hundreds of people were questioned, dozens were arrested, but no one was ever formally charged. Many theories about the Ripper's identity exist, with various different suspects being considered but not confirmed. In February 2025, British author and researcher Russell Edwards claimed that advanced DNA analysis of an old shawl revealed a 100% match between genetic material found on the garment and living descendants of a man named Aaron Kosminski, who was one of the original suspects. His methods are questioned, but this is the closest we've gotten to an answer to this day. The legend of Jack the Ripper endures today, not just because of the gruesome nature of the crimes, but also because he seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving behind only fear, speculation, and a trail of death. Albert Fish was a notorious serial killer known by many nicknames, including the Gray Man, the Brooklyn Vampire, and the Boogeyman. He was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His mother, unable to care for him, placed him in an orphanage. There, Fish claimed he was beaten regularly and developed a disturbing link between pain and pleasure. By adulthood, Fish had developed extreme sexual fetishes, including sadomasochism, self-harm, and cannibalism. Fish was married for a time and had 6 children. His family reported that he was generally a quiet and unremarkable father figure. Despite this, his private life was horrific. His crimes mainly targeted young children, both boys and girls. He would lure them with promises of work, gifts, or candy. Once isolated, he would torture, kill, and sometimes cannibalize his victims. His most infamous crime was the murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928. He convinced her parents to allow him to take her to a fictitious birthday party, and Grace was never seen alive again. Fish later sent a gruesome letter to the Budd family detailing how he killed and ate parts of Grace's body. After tracing the letter back to him, the police arrested Fish in December 1934. During questioning, Fish calmly confessed to Grace Budd's murder and also admitted to many other crimes, though not all were verified. Albert Fish was tried for the murder of Grace Budd in March 1935. His defense pleaded insanity, citing his history of mental illness and self-mutilation, but the jury found Fish legally sane and guilty of murder. He was sentenced to death and executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York on January 16, 16, 1936. Carl Panzram was born on June 28, 1891, in East Grand Forks, Minnesota. After his father abandoned the family, Panzram became uncontrollable. By the age of 8, he was already drinking alcohol and committing petty theft. At age 11, he was sent to the Minnesota State Training School, where he endured brutal physical and sexual abuse. Panzram later stated that any shred of goodness in him was destroyed during his time at the school. As a teenager and young adult, Panzram spent much of his life drifting across the United States, committing burglaries, arson, and violent assaults. He frequently used aliases and was repeatedly arrested and imprisoned, but escaped multiple times. In his early 20s, Panzram joined the U.S. Army but was quickly dishonorably discharged after being convicted of larceny. After his release, he traveled the country and later the world, committing crimes wherever he went. He confessed to murders not only in the United States but also in Africa and South America. Panzram targeted mainly young boys and men. He regularly lured them with promises of work or money before assaulting and killing them. In his own words, he claimed he had no desire for redemption and would kill as many people as he could if given the chance. In 1928, Panzram was arrested for burglary in Washington, D.C. While in custody, he confessed to a prison guard named Henry Lesser. He wrote a detailed autobiography at Lesser's request, describing his life and crimes with chilling honesty. These writings became the foundation for most knowledge about his life. In 1930, while serving a 25-year sentence at Leavenworth Penitentiary in Kansas, Panzram killed a prison worker named Robert Warnke by beating him to death with an iron bar. He refused to mount a defense at his trial, stating he wanted to be executed. He was sentenced to death, and on September 5, 1930, Carl Panzram was hanged. Before his execution, when asked if he had any last words, he reportedly said, "Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 10 men while you're fooling around." The Zodiac Killer is the name given to an unidentified serial killer who operated in Northern California during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The killer claimed in letters to have killed as many as 37, but the actual number is unconfirmed. The first known Zodiac murders took place on December 20th, 1968. High school students Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday were shot and killed near Vallejo, California, while sitting in a parked car. On July 4th, 1969, the killer struck again, shooting Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau in a parking lot. Michael survived and gave police a description of the attacker, a heavy-set white male, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, possibly in his late 20s or early 30s. In August 1969, the Zodiac began sending letters to newspapers, which included ciphers and cryptograms, some of which have never been fully solved. The killer demanded that the letters be published or he would continue killing. In these letters, he coined the name Zodiac and included symbols, most famously a circle with a cross through it. One of the ciphers, known as the 408 character cipher, was solved by a high school teacher and his wife. It revealed a disturbing message about enjoying killing because it was so much fun. However, it did not reveal the killer's identity. The Zodiac continued his murderous spree in September 1969. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking at Lake Berryessa when a man wearing a black hood with a white cross-circle symbol attacked them. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Shepard later died from her wounds, while Hartnell survived. The Zodiac continued to send taunting letters through 1974. Some of his later letters took credit for crimes that may not have been his, and his authenticity became harder to confirm over time. Over the decades, many suspects have been proposed, including Arthur Lee Allen, who was heavily investigated but never charged. To this day, the Zodiac Killer has still never been caught. Pedro Lopez, born on October 8, 1948, in Santa Isabel, Colombia, later became known as the Monster of the Andes. His mother, a prostitute, reportedly threw him out of the house at the age of 8 after she caught him molesting his younger sister. As a teenager, Lopez survived by stealing cars and selling them for parts. He was eventually arrested and sent to prison, where he claimed he was gang raped by fellow inmates. Following his time in prison, Lopez began traveling across South America. He targeted young girls between the ages of 8 and 12, abducting them from poor rural villages. He would lure the girls away, and after gaining their trust, would lead them to remote areas where he raped and strangled them. In 1980, Lopez was caught in Ecuador when he tried to abduct a girl from a marketplace. Indigenous merchants captured him and were preparing to execute him when a missionary intervened, convincing them to turn him over to the police. During questioning, Lopez confessed to the murder of more than 300 girls, 110 of them in Ecuador alone. He led police to a mass grave containing many of the victims' remains, where authorities found the remains of 53 girls. Despite the scale of his crimes, the judicial systems in South America at the time were not equipped to handle serial killers. Lopez was convicted in Ecuador of 110 murders, but was only sentenced to 16 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed. He served 14 years before being released in 1994 for good behavior. Ecuador deported him to Colombia, where he was immediately rearrested. However, instead of standing trial, Lopez was declared insane and committed to a psychiatric hospital. He spent just 3 more years there before being declared sane and released in 1998 on a $50 bail. Since his release, Lopez's whereabouts have been largely unknown. Colombian authorities issued a new warrant for his arrest in in 2002 in connection to a fresh murder, but he was never captured. As of today, it is unclear whether Pedro Lopez is alive or dead. John Gacy was born in Chicago on March 17, 1942. He had a troubled childhood marked by an abusive father and health problems. As an adult, he worked in several fields, including as a fast food restaurant manager and later as a successful building contractor. He became active in local Chicago Democratic Party politics, even posing for a photo with First Lady Rosalynn Carter in 1978. Gacy also performed at children's parties and charitable events as Pogo the Clown, a character he created himself. His clown performances added to the public horror when his crimes came to light, leading to his nickname, the Killer Clown. Gacy lured his victims, usually teenage boys or young men, by offering them work, money, or a ride. Once he had them in his home, he would overpower them, sometimes tricking them with a handcuff trick in which he pretended to show them a magic trick. He would then sexually assault, torture, and strangle them. After killing them, Gacy buried many of the bodies in the crawlspace under his house. Others were found in nearby rivers. The investigation into Gacy began when 15-year-old Robert Pius disappeared in December 1978. Gacy was one of the last people seen with him. Police searches uncovered evidence linking Gacy to several missing persons cases. When they finally searched his home, the authorities discovered human remains in the crawlspace, leading to his eventual arrest. Gacy was charged with 33 murders, the most for a single individual in U.S. history at that time. His trial began in 1980. His defense argued insanity, but the jury rejected it. Gacy was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center before being executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. Bundy spent his early years believing that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his sister. As an adult, he developed a charming and manipulative personality, which he used to lure his victims. His killing spree began in the early 1970s and stretched across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. He would frequently feign injury by wearing a cast or using crutches to appear vulnerable. After gaining his victims' trust, he would abduct, assault, and murder them. Bundy's first confirmed murders occurred in Washington state in 1974. In January of that year, Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her Seattle home. Over the next several months, more women vanished. Witnesses reported seeing a man named Ted who matched Bundy's description. Despite this, he managed to avoid arrest for years, partly because he was a law student and outwardly respectable. In 1975, he was convicted of kidnapping Carol DeRanche, one of the few women to escape him, and sentenced to prison. While awaiting trial for murder in Colorado, Bundy managed to escape twice. After his second escape in late 1977, he fled to Florida, where he committed some of his most brutal crimes. On January 15, 1978, Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, killing 2 women and seriously injuring 2 others. Shortly after, he abducted and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He was arrested again on February 15, 1978, in Pensacola, Florida. This time, authorities had enough evidence to convict him. Bundy served as his own attorney during his trials. His court proceedings were some of the first to be televised nationally in the United States. In 1979, he was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death. He was later convicted for the murder of Kimberly Leach and received a second death sentence. While on death row, Bundy confessed to killing 30 women, though investigators believe the actual number could be much higher. He gave interviews to criminologists and journalists and spoke about himself in the third person to describe his crimes. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison on January 24, 1989. Outside the prison, crowds cheered as news of his death spread. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yablushna in the Ukrainian SSR. His early years were marked by famine, war, and the harsh realities of Stalinist rule. Family accounts claim his older brother was kidnapped and eaten during the famine. Chikatilo struggled with bedwetting into his adolescence. He developed feelings of sexual inadequacy, and as he grew older, these frustrations twisted into violent sexual fantasies. Despite these personal issues, he appeared outwardly normal. He pursued education diligently, eventually earning a degree in Russian literature and engineering. He married in 1963 and had 2 children through artificial means due to his sexual dysfunction. In the 1970s, Chikatilo began working as a teacher, but was fired from several positions for inappropriate behavior towards students. His behavior escalated in 1978 when he committed his first known murder, 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova in Shakhty. Though arrested briefly, police quickly released him, and another man was wrongfully convicted and executed for the crime. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo murdered at least 52 people. His victims were mainly women and children, whom he lured into isolated areas. Once isolated, he would attack them, deriving sexual pleasure from their fear and suffering. His killings typically involved stabbing, mutilation, post-mortem sexual assault, sometimes gouging out the victim's eyes. The Soviet authorities faced immense pressure to solve the murders, but insisted that serial murder was a capitalist phenomenon phenomenon and could not happen under socialism. As a result, early investigations were misdirected and innocent people were arrested. Some were even executed based on false confessions extracted under intense pressure from investigators. Chikatilo was finally apprehended on November 20th, 1990, near a train station in Rostov after behaving suspiciously. Under interrogation, he was found guilty of 52 counts of murder and sentenced to death. On February 14th, 1994, Andrei Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot behind the right ear. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. His parents argued frequently, and he was described as withdrawn and shy. By his teenage years, Dahmer began drinking heavily and developed violent, necrophilic fantasies. Dahmer committed his first murder at age 18, just weeks after graduating high school. In June 1978, he picked up Stephen Hicks, a hitchhiker, lured him to his parents' home, and killed him with a dumbbell. He dismembered the body and scattered the remains in the woods. After the murder, Dahmer enrolled briefly at Ohio State University, but dropped out due to poor grades and alcohol abuse. He later enlisted in the U.S. Army, but was discharged after 2 years for similar reasons. After returning to civilian life, Dahmer moved to Milwaukee, where his killing spree escalated. He targeted young men, luring them to his apartment with offers of money in exchange for photographs. Once there, he would drug, strangle, and then dismember them. Dahmer preserved parts of his victims, including skulls and genitalia. He also attempted to create zombies by drilling holes into the skulls of some victims and injecting acid, hoping to create submissive, living companions. In May 1991, a teenager named Konorak Synthesomphone briefly escaped from Dahmer's apartment but was returned to Dahmer by police, who believed it was a domestic dispute. Dahmer killed Konorak soon after. The police failure to properly investigate the situation allowed Dahmer to continue killing for several more months. Dahmer's crimes were discovered on July 22, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape and flagged down police. Officers found photographs of dismembered bodies inside Dahmer's apartment, leading to his immediate arrest. A subsequent search revealed human heads in the refrigerator, a heart in the freezer, and various bones and preserved organs. Dahmer confessed in detail to 17 murders. His trial began in January 1992. Although his defense argued for insanity, prosecutors demonstrated that Dahmer was aware of the wrongfulness of his actions. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years. His trial ended prematurely when Dahmer was beaten to death on November 28, 1994 by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a deeply religious but troubled household. His father was a violent disciplinarian, and Ramirez suffered multiple head injuries as a child, leading to frequent blackouts and seizures. As a teenager, Ramirez became heavily influenced by his older cousin, Miguel Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran who showed him photographs of mutilated bodies and taught him military techniques, including stealth killing. He also developed an interest in Satanism and started using LSD. In 1984, Ramirez committed his first known murder. His victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow, who was sexually assaulted, stabbed, and mutilated in her Los Angeles apartment. Over the next year, Ramirez launched a reign of terror across the Los Angeles and San Francisco areas. He entered homes at night through unlocked doors or windows, attacking men, women, and children without a consistent pattern. This randomness made him especially hard to catch and intensified public fear. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker for his nocturnal break-ins and attacks. Police departments across Southern California collaborated to catch him, eventually finding a fingerprint at a crime scene that identified Ramirez, who had a previous record for car theft. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez's face was broadcast on television and printed on the front pages of newspapers. Recognized by a group of civilians in East Los Angeles, Ramirez was chased, beaten, and subdued until police arrived to arrest him. His trial began in 1989 and lasted over 4 years, one of the longest criminal trials in California history. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. Ramirez showed no remorse during the trial and famously said after his sentencing, "Big deal. Death always went with the territory." Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death and placed on death row at San Quentin State Prison. While incarcerated, he married one of his admirers in 1996. He remained on death row for over 2 decades, never executed. On June 7, 2013, he died of complications from B-cell lymphoma at age 53. David Parker Ray, known as the Toy Box Killer, was born on November 6, 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. His father, who was violent and largely absent, introduced Ray to sadomasochistic pornography at a young age. Ray was also bullied severely at school, leading to a withdrawn and angry personality. As a teenager, Ray developed violent sexual fantasies involving rape, torture, and murder. He joined the U.S. Army after high school and served honorably, gaining skills in mechanics and electronics. After his discharge, Ray worked as a maintenance man for the New Mexico Parks Department. Outwardly, he appeared ordinary, but privately he constructed a sophisticated torture chamber inside a trailer near his home in New Mexico. Ray outfitted the trailer, known as the Toy Box, with whips, chains, pulleys, leg spreader bars, surgical instruments, and a gynecological chair. He also had numerous sex toys, torture implements, and detailed diagrams and manuals on inflicting pain. A mirror was positioned on the ceiling, so victims were forced to watch themselves being assaulted. Ray would drug his victims to induce amnesia. Some survivors recalled Ray playing recorded audio tapes describing the horrors they would endure once they regained consciousness. Ray claimed to have murdered as many as 60 women, though no bodies were ever definitively linked to him. Authorities suspect he disposed of remains by dumping them in lakes, burying them in the desert, or feeding them to animals. The case came to light on March 22, 1999, when a woman named Cynthia Vigil escaped after being held captive for 3 days. She managed to seize Ray's keys, unlock her chains, and run to a mobile home nearby, naked and bleeding. After police arrested Ray and searched his property, they found the trailer filled with torture devices, as well as videotapes showing victims. Ray was charged with numerous counts of kidnapping, torture, and sexual assault. In 2001, Ray agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison. However, he died of a heart attack on May 28, 2002, only 3 years into his incarceration. Tsutomu Miyazaki, known as the Otaku Killer, was born prematurely on August 21, 1962, in Tokyo, and suffered from a rare birth defect that fused his wrist joints, leaving him unable to bend his hands upward. This deformity caused him to be socially isolated and bullied throughout childhood. Miyazaki retreated into a fantasy world, developing an obsession with manga, anime, and horror films. His relationship with his family deteriorated as he grew older, especially after the deaths of several close relatives. By his mid-20s, Miyazaki lived alone and worked part-time. He spent most of his free time in his apartment, which was filled with thousands of videotapes, many featuring violent pornography and horror movies. Between August 1988 and June 1989, Miyazaki abducted and murdered 4 girls between the ages of 4 and 7. His method typically involved luring the girls into his car, strangling them, and then engaging in sexual acts with their corpses. In some cases, he mutilated the bodies, drank their blood, ate their fingers, and preserved body parts as trophies. After killing his second victim, he mailed a box of her ashes, teeth, and photographs to her family. He would frequently film the bodies and liked to keep detailed records. Despite extensive media coverage and a nationwide manhunt, he continued killing until July 1989, when he was caught attempting to take indecent photographs of a young girl in a park. Bystanders intervened and called the police. During searches of Miyazaki's home, authorities found the hands and feet of one of his victims in his closet. They also found over 5,000 videotapes, including recordings of his victims and an enormous collection of violent anime and slasher films. Japanese media used Miyazaki's case to criticize otaku culture, though many experts argued that his actions stemmed from deep mental illness and family problems rather than his media consumption alone. At trial, Miyazaki exhibited bizarre behavior, including speaking in the third person and claiming that a rat man inside him had committed the murders. Psychological evaluations diagnosed him with multiple personality disorder and schizophrenia. However, the court ruled he was competent to stand trial. Miyazaki was convicted of 4 counts of murder in 1997 and sentenced to death. After years of appeals, he was executed by hanging on June 17, 2008. Aileen Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. She was abandoned by her mother at age 4 and was raised by her abusive grandparents, enduring sexual abuse and neglect. By her early teens, she was engaging in prostitution and had been expelled from her home. She gave birth to a child at 14 and never regained custody. Wuornos drifted across the country, living as a hitchhiking sex worker, eventually settling in Florida. Between 1989 and 1990, she murdered 7 middle-aged or older men while she was working as a prostitute. Her first confirmed kill was Richard Mallory, an electronics store owner, on November 30, 1989. Wuornos claimed Mallory raped her, a claim partially supported by his prior conviction for attempted sexual assault, although this was not known during her trial. The other victims followed a similar pattern. David Spears, a construction worker, was found naked along a Florida highway in May 1990, shot 6 times. Troy Burris, a sausage delivery driver, went missing in July and was later found shot. Walter Antonio, a trucker and police reservist, was discovered in November. All victims were shot with a .22 caliber pistol, usually multiple times, and stripped of identification or personal items. Wuornos initially claimed all killings were done in self-defense, saying the men had tried to rape or attack her, but over time her story shifted. She later admitted to killing out of cold blood and robbery. It is argued that her history of trauma and violence shaped a deep hatred toward men, but others believe she became desensitized to killing after the first few murders. She was arrested on January 9, 1991, after police traced stolen items to pawn shops where she had used fingerprints. Wuornos eventually confessed in detail. After being convicted of 6 murders, she was sentenced to death in 1992. She fired her legal team, declined further appeals, and insisted she wanted to die. She was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002, at Florida State Prison. Her final statement was cryptic: "I'll be back, like Independence Day with Jesus." Luis Garavito, also known as La Bestia, was born on January 25, 1957, in Geneva, Quindío, Colombia. His father was an alcoholic who subjected him to regular physical and emotional violence. Garavito also suffered sexual abuse from neighbors during his childhood. As an adult, he worked various low-paying jobs, including as a street vendor and store clerk, and was known to be transient, moving from town to town. To lure his victims, Garavito posed as a monk, teacher, charity worker, or elderly man needing assistance, targeting boys between the ages of 6 and 16. Once isolated, Garavito would bind the boys, subject them to prolonged sexual torture, and then murder them, usually by slitting their throats or stabbing them. The disappearances of so many children went largely unnoticed at first, partly because many of the victims came from impoverished communities where missing persons were not always formally reported. However, by the late 1990s, the scale of the crimes became apparent. Authorities began discovering mass graves and abandoned corpses in rural areas across Colombia. The brutality and specific pattern of the crimes pointed to a single perpetrator. Garavito was arrested in 1999 after a failed attempt to assault a young boy. He was caught by police while drinking in public, using a false identity. Once in custody, he eventually confessed in graphic detail to the murders, leading authorities to more burial sites. In total, Garavito confessed to murdering 138 boys, though authorities believe the actual number of victims could be over 300. He was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison in 2000. Due to cooperation with authorities and the law's restrictions, his sentence was later reduced to 22 years. Garavito expressed remorse during interviews, claiming he had been driven by a demon inside him. Naturally, many doubted his sincerity. He died at a hospital in Valledupar on October 12, 2023, at 66 years old.